My mother used to tell a story of her mother, who was an immigrant from Sweden, and my mother's father was a farmer from Sweden, and they settled eventually, after going to Kansas on the Homestead Act and back to Sweden and then back again, they settled in East Haddam, where they had a dairy farm. That's where my mother grew up. And if any of you are familiar with what it's like to run a farm, you know that it's a lot of work. But my mother would always praise her own mother, because every afternoon at 3 o'clock, my grandmother would stop all of her kitchen work, farm work, garden work, housework, and change her clothes, make a pot of coffee, sit down, and read her Bible. And it didn't matter what day it was. And she would rest. She'd put her feet up. And my mother would shake her head and she'd say, "I wish I had that much sense." Just last week, most of you know, I was away at a conference down in Louisiana, the Credo Conference, which is for clergy wellness. And we were asked to look at our spiritual wellness, our financial wellness, our vocational wellness, and our physical wellness. And one of the books that got brought up to our attention was a book by Richard Swenson called Margin. And the subtitle of the book is Restoring Emotional, Physical, Financial, and Time Reserves to Overloaded Lives. What they were talking about in that book, what Richard Swenson was talking about in that book, was how our lives are so full these days with all kinds of things, whether it's errands or tasks or work with long hours, or errands or emails or whatever it is. There's very little margin left. The kind of margin my grandmother knew about, where you need to have some rest. And that was in my mind as I read through that creation story. God created everything out of chaos over the course of 6 days. But God created a seventh day to rest. God created that margin. And God called everything God had created very, very good, which includes that margin. And on this Trinity Sunday, as we think about maybe a complicated doctrinal thought of what is the Trinity, I'm struck by a certain sense of wholeness and oneness in God. Of the many, many different things that God created, but as a whole, as everything, it is very, very good and whole. So the call that I feel coming from our readings this day is to think about the different parts of our lives, not as separate tasks, but as a whole. And thinking about how our God, the triune God, the one of three persons, the still God, the unchanging creator God, the journeying God, Jesus who comes out from God and walks with us every step of our lives and leads the way, and the returning God, that Spirit that draws us back into God and into the reality of God, away from our busy lives and back into the center of all things. All those aspects of God are one God, just as all aspects of our lives are one life. Just as all of us, separate creations of God, are one body, one body in Christ. So on this Trinity Sunday, it is my prayer to embrace a vision of God's wholeness, understanding that everything there is and everyone there is God's own beloved creation. And when we embrace the wholeness of separate yet one, that is when the vision of God's kingdom will be made manifest.